Okay, so again, Collins is, or Bryant is here, State here, so is Darby. Kirby is not here, Fisher is not here. Hamilton is here, Elman is here. Bring VSU here. So it's Ashley, so it's Crystal. Taylor's online. Norris is here, WVSU gear. Saunders is online. Shamblin is here, WVSU gear. Taylor Pierce is not here. Rollins is not here. Harvest is here. Young is online. There. Now that I'm missing anybody. All right. So most likely we will finish the photosynthesis lab today, or chapter today. The exam should be on Friday. If you guys want to meet with me, just send me an email. Like, hey, can you meet and cover those study guides? And I'll do that. And then once one of you tells me, hey, can you meet at this time? And once I agree with it, then I'll share it with everyone else. And they can meet with us too if they want at that time. Otherwise, I'll be recording it and they can watch the video. So any questions about that? Do the study guides. Not a lot of you didn't do the study guides for the first exam. I use the study guides to write the exams. What else? Lab. I'm so bad about this, but like I said, it's completely out of my hands. It's actually completely out of the lab manager's hands too. He ordered them on time, like he always does. We just didn't get the algae beads. So instead of doing lab, the photosynthesis lab, doing a mitosis lab. And if you haven't seen the announcement, go check your email, WVSU online, and you can find it there. Because it's all virtual, we don't necessarily need to meet. I'll be here at 10, also be online at 10. So if you need me, now that's the time to get your help. So at least take a look at it and decide if you want to come in or not. And then, assuming we get our algae beads, we'll do the other lab next week. But yes.
So lab 6 is this week. We're just doing it through like Link or Lab.
Yeah, everything on that lab is completely online. So the plan was we were going to do that lab next week, but you were all going to bring your computers in and you were all just going to work on it as I sat here and walked around and helped you. But because it's late notice, I'm not going to require you to come in. You can if you want. I'll be here to help you. I'll be online to help you, but you don't have to come in because that's last minute change. I need to force you to do something. So any questions about lab or the exam?
And we can just choose to come online if we want to or not.
Yeah. This week for lab, there'll be no attendance. As long as you get it done by Friday. And it's one of those things where it really is self-explanatory. Like we haven't covered mitosis and meiosis yet, but the pre-lab gives you enough information. You'll know what stages of mitosis. Basically, you're just going to be looking for cells at different stages of mitosis. Oh, yeah, mitosis. That's basically it. It's pretty simple lab. I did that on purpose because I was hoping that would come after the photosynthesis respiration lab, and you'd be working diligently on your lab report. So the idea was to give you a nice, easy lab after that. Now it's been swapped. What are you going to do? Any other questions? All right, let's jump back into this. Before we start, I need to hopefully at least one person remembers these questions. If not, then we don't need to move forward. So the last thing we talked about was what happens when sunlight hits a pigment, or when any light hits a pigment. What happens to the electrons in the pigment molecules when they get hit by light? Like right now, because my shirt's black, it's absorbing all the light, and there's things happening to the electrons in my shirt. What are they doing? What is it? It's moving, yep. Well, sort of. The way it visualized it, yes, it was moving the way they visualized it. And I guess you can visualize it that way. But remember, this is really important. They get excited. These electrons get excited. They're in a high energy, energized state because they basically absorb the energy from the sun. And that's what makes them in an excited state. And then, because the sun's stable, they kind of lose that excitement. And that's what gives off heat. With that in mind, what's more important is this. This stuff, again, we already said this. But this is also happening in the photosystems, which is what this is right here, right? There's a photosystem. The light hits it. It hits these pigments, your chlorophyll A, your chlorophyll B, your carotenoids. The electrons get excited. And then when they're in that excited state, they bounce around until they finally hit the middle. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, but not too much. There's a lot of words on the slide. I want to bother you. This cluster right here, right there at the bottom, it's basically like a light gathering antenna. You could almost think of it as solar panels. Because remember, we already did the overview, right? We're talking about photosynthesis. There's the energy gathering part, and then there's the actual factory, so to speak, that makes the glucose that we're after. So this is the energy gathering part. These are basically your solar panels. So again, what happens is the photon strikes the pigment, right? The electrons in the pigment get excited, and that energy actually jumps from molecule to molecule. It's not just one pigment molecule, there's a bunch of pigment molecules that are jumping around until finally it arrives at the reaction center. There's one chlorophyll A in the middle, and all that energy just bounces around until it hits that. And once that happens, then it gets to the primary electron, I should say acceptor. Oh yeah, it does. It's just not folded. The primary electron acceptor, and that traps the excited electron. And then another team of molecules uses that trapped energy to make ATP and then ATPH. So again, this is a lot of information, but this is still just the overview. We're going to go over this again. And I can tell you right now, you do not need to memorize all this. You do not need to memorize all those steps. You do need to know what a reaction center is, just because I'm going to use that term and I need to know what I mean when I use it. You do need to know what a primary electron acceptor is, again, because I'm going to use that term. I'm not going to ask you about one of those. Let's see, the first word for attendance will be ATP. So again, if you're online, send me those words. If you're in person, send them to me if you want for extra credit. Anyway, all this information is going to be on the next slide. I'll show you a picture of what's up here. And then I'll ask if you have any questions. So remember, we already saw this picture. Now we're kind of zooming into this. A photon hits one of these pigments. The electron gets excited. That energy just kind of bounces around randomly until finally it hits the middle right there. It hits the reaction center, which happens to be chlorophyll A. You don't need to know that. I'm just giving you that information. It gets excited. The primary electron acceptor catches it, so to speak. It captures that electron in its excited state. So now we still have, remember, unlike that other stuff, that last graphic I showed you where I said the electron gets excited and that's an unstable state. So the electron, it loses that energy. Energy is released. It's heat or light sometimes, right? And in this case, it's not. It's still in the excited state when it's captured. And obviously we're going to use that, right? Just think about what we did in respiration. It was all about the electrons, right? They were already excited. We stripped them away from the glucose and brought them into the electron transport chain. And that's when they lost their excitement, right? And once they lost that excitement, they lost that energy. We used that energy to make ATP. Cliff notes or spoiler alert, that's what I'm about to tell you here, right? We have this excited electron, and it's essentially the same thing that's about to happen. So any questions so far? All right, here we go. Let's talk about how the light reactions generate ATP. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, this is not the overview. This is the actual stuff, right? This is the overview. We're getting into the details. So how those light reactions generate ATP and then ATPH. And I already basically just gave you, like I said, the answer, but here we go. So there's actually two photosystems that cooperate in light reactions. I'm gonna put it next to that because I'm not even gonna ask you that. Yes, it's there for your knowledge. Your book brings it up, so do I. But you'll see. Let's make sense when I show you the picture. The photons exciting the electrons of the chlorophyll in the first photosystem. So that's the one we were just talking about where the photon hit it. And the electrons got excited and it bounced around until finally it got captured, right? That's the thing we just talked about in that bullet point. And this too, the electrons are trapped by the primary electron acceptor. What I didn't mention was this, and this is where you start getting some test questions. The photosystem then has to replace that lost electron, right? Because electrons have to come from somewhere, they have to go somewhere. So if you're pulling an electron away, then one has to replace it. That itself is not necessarily a test question. The next one is, well, no, I guess it is, yeah. So where does the electron come from? And you need to know this. It comes from the water. That will be a test question. And I've already mentioned it before. So where do the regular old electrons come from? The ones that become excited and incorporated into that molecule of glucose eventually. Where do they come from? They come from water. And what happens when the water gives up those electrons? It produces or releases whatever, oxygen. So remember, I've said this a number of times, whether we're talking about photosynthesis or respiration, in the exam, you should associate these two together. Because when water gives up electrons in photosynthesis, it produces oxygen. And the opposite is true in respiration, right? When oxygen accepts electrons, it turns it into water. Of course, I'm oversimplifying it. Obviously, other things have to happen, right? Because we know water is H2O. You don't see anything on there about hydrogen, right? It's just so. Unless you want to look into it, just trust me. This is basically what happens. There's obviously other things going on too that we don't talk about. So anyway, any questions about this slide before I show you a picture of all this? All right, here's a picture of everything we're saying. So again, the light hits the reaction center. It's exciting electrons. Those electrons get excited and basically captured by the primary electron acceptor. Since we're taking electrons away, we need to put some more back in. Where do they come from? They come from water, right? The water gives up the electrons, and in the process, that water produces oxygen. And yes, I like this picture. Actually gives a little bit more information, right? Technically, it's 2 electrons leaving. Technically, it's 2 also included 2 hydrogen ions and half of an O2 molecule, but you don't need to know those details. So again, the test questions that I see on the slide. In which of the 2 stages is water used for light systems? Right? In which of the 2 stages is oxygen produced? Light reactions. In which of the 2 stages is the solar energy used? Light reactions. In which of the 2 stages are electrons excited? Light reactions. So anyway, that's the first order system. Any questions about that before we talk about the next one? Is this excited electron has to go somewhere? So that's what we're going to talk about next. And so far, we haven't really gotten what we're after. If you remember, this is important too. What we're after for these light reactions, we want high energy electrons. Well, I guess we have that sort of. Well, we do have high energy electrons. But what we really want is the NADPH, right? So we want the high energy electrons, but we want them in that molecule. Remember, just like FATH2 and NADH from respiration, those are the things that are moving the electrons around. Well, that's what we need, right? We need that thing to have the electrons. The other big thing that we're after is ATP. So far, we haven't gotten that yet, right? We have an excited electron. We don't quite have the NADPH yet. We definitely haven't said anything about ATP. Here we go, second photosystems. That energized electron, that's one right here at the top, right, where the purple box is. That is from the first order system, passes down an electron transport chain to the second system. So here we go. This is almost identical, as far as we're concerned at this level, it is identical to respiration. Because we have an excited electron, and it's going down an electron transport chain. And just like in respiration, as you'll see in this next as you see in a different picture, it's embedded in the membranes. So just like, and I'm going to give you this information again later, but it's doing the same thing. It's pumping hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient, and then those ions come back down the concentration gradient, and it goes through ATP synthase, and that's where we get our ATP. So yeah, again, second photosystem, as far as we're concerned, it's a little bit like respiration, like the electron transport chain of respiration. You just have those electrons. I'm going to show you a picture now. The electrons going down that electron transport chain, releasing energy, and that energy is made to make ATP. Then it gets to the second reaction center. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting, sort of, right? So again, it's losing energy. It started off with no energy when it was in the water molecule. And it got excited from the sun and got captured. And then in its really excited state, it started losing a little energy. And look, this is higher than this for a reason. That's why I'll use this picture instead of the one from your book. So it's still high energy, higher than it was, but it's still not real high energy. So more photons hit it. It gets excited again. It gets even higher energy than it was over here. And at that point, it's captured by NAD+, and now you have NADPH, which are the 2 things we're after, right? So now, and we're going to talk about this more, but now we have everything we're after. The whole purpose of light reactions is to produce ATP, because we need energy to squish those carbons together to do a glucose. And we need to incorporate some high energy electrons into that molecule of glucose. So now we have what we're after. That was the purpose, the main goal. So again, my recommendation for your study is think about the big details before you look at the other stuff. And what are the 2 main things that we're after in the light reactions? ATP, high energy electrons, aka NADPH. And again, those will be test questions. Which of the 2 stages produces ATP? Light reactions. Which of the 2 stages uses them? Down the second. Which of the 2 stages produce NADPH or high energy electrons? The answer is light reactions. which is the two stages uses those high energy electrons. That'd be the one we're talking about later, so the Calvin cycle. Let's see, the next word for attendance. Let's just say it's this one, light. The next word for attendance. Anyway, any questions about this slide? After the next slide is like a different, like a metaphor for this slide, so to speak. No questions? Okay, because again, this picture's not from your book, it's from the last textbook, but I love it because it really does make sense. Because when you think about potential energy and kinetic energy as opposed to chemical energy and potential energy that way and solar energy, this makes a lot more sense, right? So you have this ball. It has almost no potential energy because it's down here at the bottom. In this case, potential energy means excited. So you get put in a little input of energy from the photon. That's given it some kinetic energy. Now it's really excited. It has a lot of potential energy. And then you can just drop it. Gravity does its thing, right? That's going to turn that. We're going to make some ATP with it. But then we need more energy. So another photon hits it. So that has even more potential energy. And then it puts it in the bucket that carries the electrons. And that bucket is called an NADPH. Any questions about that side? All right, so this next slide is stuff I've already told you, but now you're going to see it in writing. The ATP production that we just talked about, right? We just said it produces ATP. It is similar to respiration because in both, what we're using is an electron transport chain that is pumping hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient. Then again, those ions then diffuse back down the concentration gradient. It doesn't require energy to diffuse, right? And it goes through an ATP synthase, and that's what makes our ATP. This might be a test question. I'll put a big question mark next to this. But the big difference is when we're talking about the difference between photosynthesis and respiration in this context, like I keep saying, whether we're talking about photosynthesis or respiration, electrons have to come from somewhere and they have to go somewhere. In this case, we're talking about where do they come from. So remember, in cellular respiration, it's the food that provides those high energy electrons. Or let's just say it like this, because yes, technically food is more correct, but as far as the exam is concerned, we're just going to focus on glucose. Those high energy electrons came from the glucose when we were talking about respiration in the last chapter. Here in photosynthesis, those electrons came from water. They weren't energized at the time, but they became energized. Any questions about that? The next picture I'm going to show you is a visualization of this being global. It's going to look a lot like the respiration picture. Again, these pictures are not going to go into your book, and I kind of like it. Now you have these pictures, and you can look at the pictures in your book, and you can just study whichever one you like more. But there we go. So there's the photosystem. Water is donating the electrons to it. The light hits it. It gets excited. It bounces around. And then finally, it's captured and sent down the electron transport chain in its excited state. It's losing energy as it does that. That energy is used to pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient. It gets down here. It's a little bit less energized than it was, so it gets excited again with the light. This time, that excited electron is captured by the NADP+, technically turning it into NADPH. And then all those excited electrons go to the Calvin cycle so they can be incorporated into a new molecule of glucose. These hydrogen ions diffuse down the concentration gradient through ATP synthase, the enzyme that produces ATP. It produces the ATP, and then that also goes to the Calvin cycle. So now we have what we need for the Calvin cycle. We have those high energy electrons that we're going to incorporate into the new molecule of glucose. And we have the ATP, which is providing the energy to squish those carbons together. This light's irritating. Anyway, any questions about that slide? And really quickly, as a frame of reference, since you've already seen it, this is what it looks like for respiration, right? Same thing, right? The electrons are bouncing from protein to protein in the electron transport chain that's pumping hydrogen ions against the concentration gradients. Now it's really concentrated here, not very concentrated there, so they naturally just diffuse down the concentration gradient through ATP synthase, which produces ATP. So as far as we're concerned, it's the same thing. I mean, there are differences. Like, for example, you can see here, the water is on the inside of the thyroid membrane. This is where the electrons come from. And then here, no, it's the same too. Never mind. Anyway, any questions about that? Now let's talk about the really easy one. As far as we're concerned, it's really hard in higher biology classes because you talk about all the enzyme views, but this class should be easy. We're done talking about the light reactions. Let's talk about the Calvin cycle. Basically, you should think of it as the sugar factor, and I've said that before, right? The Calvin cycle is the sugar factor. Because that's what we're after. And don't forget that. I keep saying that a million times. If you forget everything else they teach you about this chapter, you should know that the whole thing that we're after in photosynthesis is glucose, right? Trying to get sugar, trying to get glucose. Sugar is a more accurate term, and you'll see why. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But I'm just going to put glucose because for the sake of studying, that's the term I'm going to use. It's glucose. But yeah, sugar is more accurate. So again, Calvin cycle, in a sense, as far as we're concerned, that's the most important. So again, if you forget everything else about this chapter, what are we trying to make with photosynthesis? Glucose. Calvin cycle is the thing that does it. And again, like I said, what the thing we just talked about provides the energy, right? If the Calvin cycle is the glucose factory, and light reactions, it's the power, that's the power plant, right? That's the solar power plant. It's providing electricity to the factory, so to speak. Anyway, what you don't necessarily need to know, but I'm going to briefly explain, is that it regenerates the starting material with each turn, which is why it's called a cycle. Each turn has chemical inputs and outputs. I'm not going to ask you that, but your book discusses it, and so did your old book, so let's really quickly talk about it. The inputs, and some of this actually you do need to know. The inputs are this carbon dioxide from the air. That will be a test question because which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? And the answer is Calvin cycle. Again, I'll remind you this. I've said it a million times, but someone's still going to miss it. In this exam, when you have any questions that ask you about carbon dioxide, whether it's saying in which stage is carbon dioxide used, like in this one, or in which stage is carbon dioxide produced, like in respiration, the answer is always going to be a cycle. So in this case, it's the Calvin cycle. If we're talking about respiration, it's the citric acid cycle. So all those C's should help you remember where carbon dioxide is either used or produced. The other test question that I've already said today, not that long ago, and which of the two stages is ATP used, not produced, because we know light stages produced it, but ATP is used in the Calvin cycle. And that should be easy to remember because, like I said, if you can just remember the Calvin cycle is producing the glucose, then the fact you know it needs carbon because glucose is C6H12O6. That should be easy to remember. That's the whole Calvin cycle, all the C's. Obviously, if you're producing something, you're doing it in energy. So obviously, it's going to be the thing using the ATP. Likewise, we already know from respiration, because I kept saying this word a million times, stripping away high energy electrons, high energy electrons, high energy electrons. The glucose has high energy electrons. So therefore, it should be easy to remember that obviously the thing that's producing the glucose, the Calvin cycle, it's going to need some high energy electrons to put into that glucose. Those are definitely test questions. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. I'm just going to put an X to it before I talk about it. So like it says up here, technically this functions as a sugar factory, and then I crossed it out. Said technically sugar is more correct, but I'm going to write glucose here because glucose is what we talk about. But technically, just for your own knowledge, and I'm not going to test you on this, technically what it's making is something called G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And then that G3P is then used to make glucose and also other things. But we don't need to worry about that. You can look it up for independent work if you want. I just told you it makes glucose. But what else is that G3P made for or used to make? So again, as far as I'm concerned, as far as the test is concerned, you do not need to know G3P. That shouldn't be on there. It won't be on there. So any questions about the side before I show you a picture of the Calvin cycle? All right. So here's the accepting molecule. You don't need to know the name of it, but this, the other textbook included it. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon sugar called RUPP. It takes in one more carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air. Hopefully, if you're a thinking student, you're looking at this and something's confusing you about this. Somebody look at that and tell me what's wrong with that picture. While I take a sip of my coffee. What do you think is wrong with this picture? This sugar is accepting a carbon dioxide, a carbon from the air. And then we end up with this thing. Anybody see the problem? All right, like I said, this one has 5 carbons. Carbon dioxide has 1 carbon. And I know we don't have any math majors in here because I've asked before. Can anyone volunteer to answer this question? What is 5 plus 1? That's exactly right. 6. So what we should have when you add 1 carbon to a 5 carbon molecule is a 6 carbon molecule. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm not going to test you on it. Is the fact that the book doesn't even talk about that. So what technically happens is what you get is a 6 carbon molecule when you're not seeing there's another step in here where that 6 carbon molecule is broken in half. So what we actually have are 2 of these 3 carbon molecules, not just 1. So again, I'm not going to test you on that. I just know if I was a student and I was studying this after the lecture and someone didn't bring this up to me, that would confuse the hell out of me. Because like, how do you go from 5 plus 1 gives you 3, right? That doesn't make sense. So I just wanted to bring that up. Oh, also, all of these would be good independent work questions, right? So I'm telling you, there's 2 of these 3 carbon molecules. For some reason, the old textbook didn't even tell you the name of them. Well, you don't need to know the name of them. There's no need to name this one. What's that matter, right? So if you want to, you can look up the name of that molecule or the enzyme that makes it. Anyway, so now we have that 3 carbon molecule, or 2 of them. Now we need a little bit of energy. We need some NADPH, right? We need those hydrogen electrons. That stuff's incorporated, and at that point, we have the G3P sugar. Technically, again, I like this. We have 2 of those. Well, that's not what it's saying, but we had 2 of those G3P sugars, right? Because, like I said, we had 2 of those 3 carbon molecules. Now we have 2 G3P sugars, one of which it leaves, and it's used to make glucose and other stuff, and the other one continues the cycle. It is then converted with a little bit more energy. That 3 carbon molecule is turned into this 5 carbon molecule, and the circle of life continues. Really confusing, and well, not really confusing. It's slightly confusing, but again, just to make things a little bit more simple, and I've said this already before today. Which of the 2 cycles uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle or stages. Which of the 2 stages uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages uses high energy electrons from NADPH? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages produces glucose? The answer is the Calvin cycle. Yeah. Now again, if you want to, you can look this up for independent work and tell me all the missing stuff. There's a lot of missing stuff in this thing. This is the Cliff Notes version. Any questions about that picture? The next word for attendance, I'm just going to point at it or draw an arrow to it. I'm not even going to say it. If you're online, take a look at the screen. There's an arrow pointing to the next attendance word. Okay, so make sure you guys can see it too. All right, there's no questions there. Let's look at the big picture again. The whole big picture. This is everything that's happening inside the chloroplast. You have the light reactions on one side, the Calvin cycle on the other. Which of the 2 stages is using light? If anyone misses that one, you should like get half credit on the exam because it's in the word, right? Which of the 2 stages uses light? It's the light reactions. Which of the 2 stages uses water? Producing oxygen? Light reaction. Which of the 2 stages produces NADPH or gives high energy electrons? Light reactions. Which of the 2 stages produces ATP? Light reactions. Which of the 2 stages uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages uses high energy electron? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. And which of the 2 stages produces glucose? Calvin cycle. A lot of test questions on there. And that's basically what the exam is going to consist of for the photosynthesis portion. Right? The rest of these details you don't necessarily remember. Like, yes, technically Calvin cycle is providing a DP for the light reactions, right? So then the light reactions can put that phosphate back to together with the ADP. And yes, technically the Calvin cycle is producing an ADP plus. So then the light reactions can add some electrons to it and turn it into an ADPH, but we're not getting into that much detail. So that's it. We are done with this chapter. Any questions about anything? Yes.
I was just looking at the study guide or whatever,
Mhm.
and it's still doing the same thing, the viewer commission thing. It's not letting me in, like any study guide. That was, it was interesting problem last test too. I couldn't get it.
For the study guides, and you're definitely logged into your WBSU email account?
Yeah, so I scroll down,
Yeah, let me take a look.
On my chapter 4 study guide, there's only one question.
yeah,
And it just says more questions to come, and that's the
That's
question.
the problem. Thank you. I'll look at all these things.
this is chapter 4. And I'll get a chapter 5. And then
It's so weird. Yeah, I'll look into it and you guys just keep checking back on it. And yeah, I'll fix it like, luckily we're done early. So that's what I'm gonna do right now. Let's fix those problems for you. That's it then. Yeah, I'll look into that. Unless you guys have any other questions. All right, so remember, bring your computers to class on Friday because that will be the exam.
Like,